If you come to this conference every year, the next speaker will no doubt be familiar to you. Every January, ADI runs a year-end survey in which helps us understand how the craft spirit movement is evolving. And every year, our research economist, Michael Kinstlick, crunches the numbers and tells us what this survey means. He finds hidden meaning in the data that tells us where we are, where we have been, and where we are going. You may ask yourself, how did I get here? And here to tell you is Michael Kinstlick.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks, everyone, for coming here to beautiful Portland for this year's edition of the ADI conference. As Drew mentioned, I'm hoping to share some good information with you all. I thought I would start with a little detour from the numbers into the words. So I took a look at all the names of the craft distillers out there and took out the obvious distiller, distilling, spirits, and looked at what are the key phrases and words that we're using to come up with our name. And so if you are just getting started and you need some inspiration, we can send this out and you can print it later, get out your darts, and come up with your winning distillery name. Lots of good ones up there. But really, let's talk about some numbers here because that's what really matters. So I start, as Drew mentioned, with a database of 3,200 craft distillers and other distillers. These are DSP holders. These are ADI listings that were non-DSP holders, some of them still around that may become distillers. Some of them lost to the mist of time and probably never made it into the market. But I can say right now, there are approximately 1,400 craft producers making spirit for sale in the country today. Probably about 1,200 actual distillers, and then maybe another couple hundred rectifiers, blenders, infusers, and those sorts of organizations. We see no sign of shortage of growth in the market to come. So that's the main message I wanted to leave here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about DSPs today, and I wanted to just make sure we're all on the same page of why DSPs matter and what makes them special. First, DSP, distilled spirits plant. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the TTB forms that require for permitting to produce beverage alcohol. And these are important because you can't produce beverage alcohol without a distilled spirits plant permit, right? We all know that. So having a DSP is a necessary condition to be in the market. So if I find a craft producer and I see no evidence that they have a DSP, I know they're not making spirit themselves. They must be outsourcing or having someone else do it for them. So who has DSPs? Well, obviously the major producers, companies like Beam Suntory and Diageo and Gallo and Korbel have many of them dozens of DSPs under their names. Then, of course, all of the craft producers and distillers. And then you have other producers, co-packers, food companies, just various entities that might be making a ready-to-drink margarita or things like that. So there are quite a number of listed DSPs who are not distillers, who are not craft producers, but who nonetheless have a license. And of course, potential future producers, because oftentimes we see getting a DSP as the first step towards actually getting into production and entering the market. So let's take a look at some charts. This is pretty stunning. Over the last 8 years or so, the number of new DSPs being added each month has gone from 10 to over 40. And so if you think about that now, that means that every working day, our friends in Kentucky at the TTB are processing 2 new licenses. Let that sink in. And so we've gone from about 560 DSPs around the end of 2010 to 2,600 now, pretty much. Probably over 2,600. That 2,598 number is from the late January this year. So we're almost certainly getting close to 2,700 now at that, or even 2,750 at that rate of 2 per day. And so when I think about DSPs, I divide them into various categories. So we have our craft producers, craft distillers, folks that I see in the ADI directory, and I know that they are out there making product. Then I have a category that I refer to as the hidden producers. These are folks that I can say for certain or with statistical estimation are in the market, but have not yet revealed themselves through a listing at the ADI. Then I have the other craft producers, those infusers and blenders that I mentioned, the other producers, the large makers, the ready-to-drink manufacturers, then the non-producers, those DSPs that I've not yet seen any sign of production from, and then the guys who have had DSPs and then drop out over time. And that's not necessarily because they're out of the market. You often have a producer that will move their facility from one location to another. They get a new DSP at the new location. They surrender the old DSP, so it can be an even trade. But we do see, obviously, not all DSPs that get licensed remain outstanding forever. So, 2,900 DSPs since 2010. We've got over 1,000 craft producers out of that, a couple hundred hidden producers, other producers, and then at the bottom there, a few hundred drops and almost 1,000 what I call non-producing DSPs. These are the guys who are waiting in the wings. These are the guys, mostly recent licensees, who have not yet gotten their product out, and maybe they haven't even begun production yet. I'm going to go through this in blocks to look at through time, and you'll see, basically, if we look at the older cohorts from 2010, 11, and 12, and that 2010 number, of course, that's the original list that I got. That includes very old DSPs. Each of these subsequent panels are just the new additions from the subsequent year, from the prior year. So we see in these older cohorts, pretty much all of them have sorted themselves into their buckets. We don't see very many non-producers out there. We don't see many hidden producers. By now, generally, the craft producers that are out there have become picked up at the ADI directory, and we are aware of them, we see them. There may be a handful that are still out there, aging spirit, that haven't released yet, but very, very few. When we go a little further along, we now see a little larger pool of those hidden producers who I'm sure will become revealed over time. But again, more non-producers, and we see, sort of a more normal kind of shuffling. And now here's the recent set. Huge, huge number of non-producers sitting out there from the last couple years. And so we see that is a pool of entrants waiting to happen. And of course, here we see very few drops from the recent listings, of course, because they haven't had time yet. And so what does that all mean? We're still on that exponential growth path. We've seen no signs of a slowdown or a dip in that market yet. And I want to talk a little bit about release volumes. The TTB was kind enough to start posting release volumes by distillery size last year. So we have data through 2016. The gold bars there at the top, those are the very large distillers, 750,000 or more proof gallons. There's about 40 of them in the country. And then the bars at the bottom there are the smaller producers. And we see tremendous growth there, of course, in the smaller production categories. However, that's not the full picture. That was only up to 50 million proof gallons. When we look at the total growth in the market, we see that the large producers have actually grown their volume more, 3 times more, than the total volume of all the craft producers. So while the market share of the craft producers has gone from infinitesimal to now about 1.75%, we also see huge room for growth going forward. Craft beer is now 15% or so of the US beer market. Distilled spirits, still less than 2%. Tremendous opportunities in the future. And so when we look at the number of distilleries versus the number of breweries, I know many of you have seen this slide in the past, we still see no signs of a slowdown, and the market's still appears to be tracking the craft beer market with that 20-year lag. So I get asked these questions. Are we at peak craft? Is the craft apocalypse upon us? I see no signs of a slowdown in DSP ads, in new DSPs getting licensed. I see no signs of an uptick in new DSP drops, in existing DSPs going away. And we still have craft distilleries with tiny US market share. So it's hard for me to draw the conclusion yet that we are at peak craft or that the craft boom is slowing down in any meaningful way. We see continued ongoing growth, and this is actually just the resurgence of a US industry is following a classic pattern, just like the craft beer market did. Feel free to find me in the halls today and ask questions. Happy to share more. This presentation will be available on the ADI website going forward, and you can always download the full set of white papers from the Copper Sea website. Thanks very much. I'll hand it back over to Drew, and have a wonderful conference in Portland.